By the 14th of October 1941, the forces of Operation Typhoon, Hitler's plan to capture Moscow, had struggled through a week of torrential rain and tenacious Russian resistance. The roads had disintegrated into canals of bottomless mud, along which wheeled vehicles could drive only at a snail's pace and only if they were towed by tanks. Despite the conditions, the Germans had advanced to within 100 kilometers of the Russian capital. The Russians had passionately defended every inch of their motherland, with little regard for their own lives. Their suffering had been intense, but there was still more and worse to come. Less than 1 year later, they were to be engulfed in a massive German onslaught as Hitler's campaign in Russia reached its bitter zenith at Stalingrad. In Moscow, the nerve center of the Soviet Union, the proximity of the German armies threw the inhabitants into total disarray. Mass evacuations were organized, while some citizens simply fled of their own accord. Even Stalin and his government prepared to abandon their capital.
There are lots of rumors about Stalin and Moscow. But Stalin, for all his faults actually, and from what one can gather from talking to some of his closest aides, he had no intention of leaving Moscow and made that quite plain. And he asked Zhukov actually, in the middle of October actually, when there was a huge panic in Moscow, and Moscow virtually evacuated itself. It's called in Russian Bolshoi Drap, the big skedaddle. This was an unauthorized evacuation. And Stalin, although the city had been mined and everything was ready to be blown up, Stalin said to Zhukov, "Can we hold Moscow?" And Zhukov said, "Yes, we can." Stalin said, "Right, that's it." And he remained in Moscow. And he was there, and genuinely there. It was very important he was there on the 7th of November 1941. I mean, he was physically there. He made the broadcast. I mean, it was perfectly apparent that Stalin was there, and Stalin was there to stay.
The remaining citizens of Moscow were scoured for recruits to a civil reserve force, which was hastily mobilized to the front. Stalin now learned from his spies in Japan that the Japanese government did not intend to attack in the east. Freed of the nightmare of war on a second front, he ordered the transport of 22 fresh divisions of well-equipped Siberian forces to Moscow. The November frosts came late but sharp. General Guderian had earlier requested winter supplies, but had been rebuked for negative thinking. The Germans began to find a concrete use for the propaganda leaflets they had been issued with, stuffing them into their uniforms to keep the cold at bay. In Moscow, Stalin struggled to kindle the flame of citizen morale by staging the traditional Revolution Day parade despite the dangers of aerial bombardment. In his speech at Lenin's tomb, he again appealed to the ancient Russian tradition of heroism in the face of adversity. The war you are waging is a war of liberation, a just war. May you be inspired in this war by the heroic figures of our great ancestors. Hitler had insisted that his armies should divide and approach Moscow from the north and south simultaneously. By the end of November, they were only 30 kilometers from their target. The spires of the Kremlin were tantalizingly within their gaze. But Hitler's arrogance in failing to provide winter supplies was now disastrously limiting their progress. Without antifreeze, motor vehicles would not start, and planes could not fly. In a final assault, which had begun on the 1st of December, the Germans came as close as 15 kilometers to Moscow. Zhukov's western front then began to drive back the northern arm of their encirclement, and southern front halted Guderian's forces around Tula to the south. Mobile groups of Russians destroyed fuel dumps and artillery deep behind the German lines. The troops of the Third Reich now faced fully equipped Russian infantry, snugly clad in their felt boots and greatcoats. Harried by ski battalions, they watched their enemies' T-34 tanks crash through snow and woodland, while their own panzers sluggishly negotiated the roadways. German morale wilted. The hard-pressed soldiers, most of them still clad in their summer uniforms and tight leather boots, fell back rapidly, often abandoning huge caches of equipment in their haste. Encouraged by their breakthrough, the Russian High Command attempted to turn the German tactics on themselves and encircle their entire army group center. Despite Hitler's orders to stand firm, by the end of the year, the Germans had withdrawn up to 150 kilometers from Moscow. Generals Guderian and Höppner had been dismissed for retreating without permission.
The Red Army line was shortening, and Zhukov and Rokossovsky were, by moving up the reserve front, were beginning to be able, I think, to have a more coherent defense. Although it wasn't all that powerful, at least it began to react. And the Germans, in a sense, it literally, that phase of the offense ran into the ground. And then, as you remember, the Germans had to, in a sense, catch their breath again and make a second and final lunge, as it were.
The Russian counterattack was further strengthened by the reinstatement of officers condemned to the prison camps during Stalin's Great Purges. They were ferocious warriors. As the wounded commander of the 222nd Rifles told his German interrogators, "If a man has a penal camp behind him, death holds no terror for him." Less distinguished prisoners were released into penal battalions, which performed the most dangerous tasks such as clearing minefields and storming strongpoints. The casualty rate in these battalions was the highest in the Red Army, but prisoners still volunteered for military service. The death rate in the camps had increased sevenfold since 1940.
This was when Stalin sounded the most alarming and warning note. This was when he issued the order, not one step backwards, and he meant not one step backwards. He imposed, for example, penal battalions on the Red Army, anybody moving out of line. And if you look at the fact, for example, that perhaps some 400,000 Russian soldiers were put in penal battalions in the war, show you the scope and the scale of discipline. At the Battle of Stalingrad, 13,500 men in the Red Army were put in penal battalions and very probably shot.
At Leningrad, food supplies to the besieged city had been worsening throughout the autumn. By late November, they were at their lowest ebb of the whole siege. Manual workers were receiving only 250 grams of bread per day, 1/3 of their normal requirement. Without water for sanitation and basic medical supplies, disease became rampant. As temperatures fell to the -20s, thousands began to die each day. Total starvation threatened constantly. To the Germans, collapse seemed imminent. Back in Berlin, a reception with Adolf Hitler as guest of honor was organized to celebrate the fall of the stricken city. The invitations were printed, but never posted.
A very interesting picture you get is to talk to women soldiers in the Red Army, who were in combat units, by the way. And if you talk to the medical sisters, actually, they were up with sections and platoons fighting hand-to-hand with the Germans. And there you get a really, perhaps a more vivid picture of the kind of life that was led, with women trying to... Sometimes these women medics had to pick up a machine pistol and deal with the Germans themselves. So you've got women and those reminiscences and recollections of that kind of fighting is absolutely ghastly. Or of women who are at Stalingrad trying there. And seeing, for example, there's one terrible scene a lady was telling me about, on an ice floe floating down the Volga. Here were two groups of German and Russian soldiers dead, frozen into immobility. I mean, the ferocity and the inhumanity of the conflict beggars the imagination.
The Russians marked a road across the frozen southwest corner of Lake Lagoda, and by the 22nd of November, convoys of lorries were barely staving off famine in the city. It was a hazardous passage through the biting northeastern gales which swept across the lake. Yet, for all its horror, the Russians knew that defending this lifeline to the city was the only possibility of keeping the inhabitants alive. But the food coming across the ice was too little, too late for some. Victims of starvation, suffering from falling blood pressure and the wasting of the heart and internal organs, would never regain their health. Many would die months after food and medical supplies finally arrived. The children who survived would emerge totally traumatized by the siege. It was reflected in the way many of the children played all by themselves, in the way that even in their collective games they played in silence with grave faces. I saw faces of children which reflected such thoughtfulness and sorrow that those eyes and faces told one more than could be gathered from all the stories of the horrors of famine. As the new year approached, there was every reason for Stalin to feel optimistic about the outcome of the war. The German blitzkrieg had slowed to a crawl, halted, and was now grinding into reverse. It also seemed that the great exodus of industry to the east had been successfully accomplished.
They had managed to move out considerable elements of tank factories and aircraft factories. It wasn't so much a question of the proportion, it was a question of which particular plants. For example, the Kharkov tractor works, which produced tanks, was very. They managed to get that out. The workers in that factory walked along the railway line, by the way, under German gunfire to get in the trains to be moved out. They got the equipment out, and they took the workers out. So what happened, of course, was in 1942, as the Wehrmacht bit deeper into Russia, then there had to be a second wave of evacuation. But by 1943, towards the end of autumn, they're beginning to move. There's a re-evacuation. So it was a colossal. It was the largest industrial migration in the history of the world. Well over, I think it's about 1,900 plants were moved eastwards, and then, even without infrastructure there, factories were put on the bare ground. And in one aircraft factory, within, I think it was about 17 days of being relocated, they were producing their first aircraft.
While the next 3 months would prove critical, the economic war had been put on a sound footing. Before November, the Soviet Union had lost between 1/2 and 2/3 of its productive capacity in coal, pig iron, steel and aluminium, along with 1/4 of its engineering capacity. Its total industrial output had been halved. The eastern industrial enclaves rapidly became the cornerstone of the Russian war effort. the instant expansion of the Ural, Siberian and Kazakhstan centers of production in the first year of the war was nothing short of miraculous. The conditions of work were horrendous. Many of the evacuated workers were laboring in sub-zero temperatures while the factories were still being constructed around them. They slept on the floors beside their machines, or in crude dugouts next to the factories. Food was scarce and medical resources virtually non-existent. In the first phase of the relocation, output per head was poor, and the mortality rate among the workers was high. By the summer of 1942, output had begun to climb. As conditions improved, the production levels rose until the contribution of these areas reached 2.5 times the production of the entire pre-war Soviet economy. On land, the T-34 tank was now becoming standard, to the dismay of the German panzer groups. When the first of these medium tanks was met by the 17th Panzers, they found that their shells simply bounced off its heavy, sloped armour, while its high-velocity 76mm turret gun proved devastating. It ploughed through the advancing Germans for 9 miles before being halted by a field artillery howitzer at short range. Its powerful diesel engine enabled it to sail over terrain that the panzers totally balked at. But despite Soviet optimism, the war was far from nearing its end. The Russian defenders had paid a terrible price for their resistance, and the toll in human terms would continue for the next 3 years.
If you talk to the Russians, they will say, and they will tell you, and many will tell you, that 1942 was a worse year than 1941. Because 2 things happened. Stalin had a rush of blood to the brain and decided on premature offensive operations in the late winter, if you like, and early spring of 1942. And what happened as a result of that? You had perhaps the greatest disaster which befell the Red Army in the summer of 1942, when, in the German drive to the south into the Caucasus and further east, the Red Army really was nearly destroyed. But what happened there mystified Hitler, because instead of the great big encirclement operations of 41, the Red Army wasn't there. It had actually begun sensibly to retreat.
The Soviet casualties in the first 6 months of the invasion had been staggering. It was only 50 years later that it would be admitted that 1.5 million troops had perished in the defense of Moscow alone. Many of those who were taken prisoner by the Germans fared worse than the dead. The German High Command alleged that the Russians had refused to abide by the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war and encouraged German troops to seek revenge on such barbarous subhumans. The Soviet Union had in fact undertaken to observe the Geneva Protocols, and through neutral Sweden had requested that Germany do the same. Germany's response was to shoot Russian prisoners out of hand, to gas them, starve them, and deprive them of the medical supplies necessary for their survival. Many were crammed into rail carts and left in sidings to perish. Others were force-marched until they died from exhaustion. More were simply exposed to the deadly cruelties of the Russian winter. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners had been murdered by 1942, and this was to set an horrendous trend which would continue throughout the course of the war.
The Germans made no provision for their prisoners of war. They were left in the open, they were starved, they were beaten, they were shot, they were used. As a matter of fact, the German army very frequently used the bodies of Russian prisoners as emergency bridging equipment, to try. So the degree of barbarization which set in at a very early stage in the Soviet-German War, the Great Patriotic War, was a feature which persisted until the very last day of that war. And it was deliberate, and it was organized, it was systematic. And although the German army has tried to make excuses for itself, saying it had no part of it, this is simply not true. Indeed, if you look at Manstein's early orders in 1941, he is as enthusiastic for this barbaric policy as was anybody else. So it simply wasn't the Einsatzgruppen or the SS who did it. The German soldier finally was relieved of all sense of criminal responsibility under German military law. He was, from that point of view, an unbridled and unchecked agent. And don't worry, he took full advantage of it.
The total number of Russian prisoners to be captured would eventually be reckoned at 5.5 million. Hermann Goering told Ciano, Mussolini's envoy, that Russian prisoners, having been forced to eat the soles of their own boots, had then resorted to cannibalism, and had also eaten a German sentry. Some nations, he continued, must be decimated. There is nothing to be done about it. The paltry figure of 3.5 million slaughtered Russian POWs was a drop in the ocean for Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. Himmler's plans for the new order in Europe envisaged the reduction of its Slav population by at least 30 million. And it was Himmler and his deputy Heydrich who were the real masters of occupied Russia. Field Marshal Keitel, when asked why the supposedly civilized commanders of the German army allowed the barbarities of the Russian invasion to occur, protested that even the commander-in-chief of the army did not have the executive power or authority to issue and enforce laws in the occupied East. This prerogative belonged strictly to Heydrich and Himmler, who had, de facto, discretionary powers over the life and death of population and prisoners, including prisoners of war. Himmler's sinister executioners, the Schutzstaffen, or SS, became the supreme rulers of Western Russia. Even before Barbarossa, the SS had discussed with the army officers how they could be facilitated in the campaign of terror they were to unleash in the wake of the invasion. In May 1941, 4 Einsatzgruppen were formed, with the primary aim of eliminating the ideological opponents of the Reich. Soviet officials, commissars and Jews were to be rounded up and shot to death. In the event, those who were dispatched swiftly by a bullet were the fortunate. Local Jewish leaders in Russia were forced to assemble their people in designated areas. From these collection points, they were transported to killing fields, where they were stripped of their clothing and riddled with machine gun fire. The sheer numbers involved often meant that the wounded were also tipped into the burial pits and covered up to suffocate. At Kiev in September 1941, over 33,000 Jews were murdered in a single operation which lasted 2 days. In Pinsk, the carnage was accomplished with the use of grenades, dogs, axes, and the cavalry of the SS. It was difficult, demanding work, and soldiers were rewarded with treble pay and long holidays. Erich Ohlendorf, one of the Einsatzgruppen commanders, boasted that he had personally disposed of 90,000 victims, mainly Jews, in the first year of the war. But it was not only Jews who suffered. Anyone could be accused of being an official or a commissar and summarily executed. German troops were actively encouraged to commit outrage on an occupied population which was to be subjugated by terror. People were brutalized for real or imagined offences, despite regulations, and women were raped in the streets in full view of horrified onlookers. As well as carrying out this policy of repression and ethnic sanitation, officials in Russia were also obliged to provide forced labour for the German war economy. This allowed male civilians in the Reich to be freed for military service. The German officials in Russia went about the task with an eerie mixture of barbarity and incompetence. Potential recruits were gathered without any discrimination as to their suitability. They were often left unfed for long periods, and conditions on the westbound freight trains which carried them were insanitary and inhuman. Babies born on the journey were ripped out of their mothers' arms and flung onto passing embankments to perish. Not surprisingly, by the end of 1941, 100,000 of those transported from the Ukraine were sent back as unfit to work. Many did not survive the return journey. Those waiting to travel westwards were forced to watch the dead comrades being unloaded from the trains they themselves would have to occupy. This treatment of occupied peoples, some of which had welcomed the Nazis as saviours from the tyranny of Stalin, eventually gave rise to resistance movements determined to exact revenge for the brutalities which had been inflicted on them. The atrocities were etched deep into the psyches of those who witnessed them and inspired an implacable hatred for the perpetrators. Hitler was rapidly losing faith in the commanders who had failed to bring Barbarossa to a successful conclusion. He had already dismissed both the cautious von Rundstedt and the audacious Guderian. The friction between Hitler and his generals became vocal and more rancorous as the winter wore on. Despite this, as the January initiative became bogged down in the spring thaw, Stalin had little to show for an offensive which was so ruthlessly driven that it produced more Russian than German casualties. The Volkov front managed to penetrate von Lieb's Army Group North, but its Second Shock Army were isolated at the spearhead of the penetration, and the attack was repulsed. Further south, Northwest Front encircled 90,000 men of von Lieb's army in an 800 square mile area near Diensk. However, in an heroic operation, which won the personal praise of the Führer, the Luftwaffe managed to stave off a withdrawal by providing the Diensk pocket with 270 tons of supplies each day, until eventually a corridor was pushed through to relieve the defenders. The 29th Army of the Kalanin Front, which had almost completed an encirclement of a large portion of Army Group Centre, was itself surrounded and destroyed. Army Group South managed to contain the bulge that was developing under attack from the Russian South and Southwest fronts. In the Crimea, Russian gains were restricted to the Kerch Peninsula. It had been the most brutal winter in living memory, and both sides emerged exhausted, although the German armies should have been well prepared for the terrible conditions. Army General Meretskov wrote, "I will never forget the endless forests, the bogs, the waterlogged peat fields, the potholed roads, the punishing battle with the forces of the enemy that went on side by side with the equally punishing battle with the forces of nature. The The German armies emerged from the winter fighting in a state described by General Franz Halder, Hitler's chief of staff, as disastrous. Of the 162 divisions facing the Red Army, only 11 were fully capable of offensive operations. For the 16 panzer divisions in the east, only 140 serviceable tanks were available, and most divisions were only 20% mobile. Nevertheless, Hitler was determined that a full-scale attack should be resumed. It was a question of advance or retreat.
The Wehrmacht wasn't entirely an armoured army. Of course, it had large and important components of infantry. What people forget, actually, is that while the tanks are streaking across the Russian plain, the German infantry is marching. It conducted incredible infantry marches. You know, the infantry did the marching, by the way, to cover the ground. And so you've got a proportion, I think, out of over 160 German, 68 divisions, of which 19 are panzer divisions, some of them certainly spread out, as it were. So the impression that the Soviet-German war was a series of dramatic, high-speed, armoured lunges and advances. If you look closely at the Soviet-German war, it's rather different, actually. One, and this is very often ignored, it was really a war of great sieges. Leningrad, Odessa, Sevastopol, Moscow. And then that was reversed as the Red Army advanced. The sieges are then on the German side. And the second thing was, if you look at the operations on the central part of the Soviet-German front, it was very importantly a struggle for control of the railway lines, because this facilitated a logistical movement. And when the Germans were deprived of much of their rail communications, they were in serious trouble. One of the great successes of the Red Army, by the way, was it didn't wait to capture huge stretches of railway line. They would simply advance a short distance and build a railway line.
Halder even considered recommending a withdrawal to the pre-war border in Poland. Quite wisely, he never mentioned this to Hitler. If the German armies stepped back, then Russia could regroup her forces, recover her raw materials, and rebuild her Western industries. Hitler had been informed by the economic lobby in Germany that without fresh oil reserves, it could not sustain the war effort. The oil fields of the Caucasus beckoned temptingly. All thoughts of withdrawal were pushed aside. The losses of manpower, vehicles and tanks which had been suffered since the outbreak of hostilities could not be fully made good for the new offensive. Infantry divisions were now to total 7 battalions instead of 9. The battle strength of companies was reduced from 180 troops to 80. Between November 1941 and March 1942, only 7,500 vehicles were supplied to replace the 75,000 which had been lost, and fuel oil was in short supply. Mobility had been seriously affected. The panzer divisions which would take part in the summer offensive in the south contained barely 135 tanks each. Even this had only been achieved by seriously weakening northern and central divisions. The one weapon that Hitler did have on his side was surprise. Stalin had assumed that Hitler would resume his attack on Moscow and heavily reinforced its defensive reserves. But when the Germans struck on the 8th of May, it was the Crimean front which was torn apart by von Manstein's 11th Army. The German strategy was to clear its flanks for a concerted drive towards the oil fields of the Caucasus. While von Manstein subdued the Crimea, Timoshenko's southwest front, which lay on the northern flank of the drive, was to be destroyed by the 9th and 57th Armies. When the German encirclement was completed, almost the total reserve of T-34 and KV-1 tanks, built up over the winter months, was in German hands, along with over 2,000 guns and almost 250,000 prisoners. In the south, von Manstein had by now entered the final phase of his Crimean campaign, and only the fortress of Sebastopol, besieged since the previous year, was still under Soviet control. After 250 days of dogged resistance, Sebastopol finally capitulated on the 4th of July. The victorious troops were ordered north to Leningrad despite pleas to cross the Kerch Strait and bolster the main offensive. The German forces were now organized into two groups. Army Group B struck eastwards from Kursk to the north and Kharkov to the south, but failed to encircle the retreating Soviet forces. Hitler, convinced that the main body of the Red Army had retreated to the area north of Rostov, ordered a huge encirclement of the city. In doing so, he pulled the 4th Panzer Army away from its advance down the Donets corridor towards Stalingrad. It was a fatal mistake. Von Kleist was to write later, "The 4th Panzer Army was advancing on my left. It could have taken Stalingrad without a fight at the end of July, but was diverted south to help me in crossing the Don. I did not need its aid. It merely congested the roads I was using." When it turned north again, a fortnight later, the Russians had gathered just sufficient forces at Stalingrad to check it. After taking Rostov, Army Group A continued along the Black Sea coast toward the foothills of the Caucasus. Hitler had planned to take Stalingrad and then proceed southwards. He was now committed to achieving both objectives simultaneously. By late August, Army Group A was running into stiff resistance from the newly formed Trans-Caucasus Front, defending the span of the huge mountain chain from the Black Sea to the Caspian. A Russian southeast front was also established to protect the plains to the northeast of the mountains. The Caucasus Front contained Georgians, Armenians and Azerians who were well aware of what a German invasion would mean for themselves and their families. Their resistance was desperate and determined. Approximately half the adult males of Georgia would eventually sacrifice themselves in the bitter struggle for their homeland. Not only was resistance hardening in front of Army Group A, but their strength was constantly being eroded to bolster the battle for Stalingrad to the north. The Caucasian oil wells had been the primary target of the German summer offensive. The taking of Stalingrad was at first simply an obvious target to protect the left flank of Army Group A. Had Stalingrad not been named in honor of the Russian leader, it might have remained a subsidiary target.
Stalingrad became, if you like, a symbol of German endurance, of German capability. It also had important strategic significance, by the way, because if they'd cut across the Volga, they sliced right through the Russian lines of communication for oil, for transport. So it wasn't a facile thing. But it became invested with enormous psychological significance. Both sides really in this ghastly chest-to-chest struggle from which they couldn't be unlocked, from which no one could see how they could be unlocked, except one had to be destroyed and the other become victor. And it had the quality of that kind of struggle. So the political importance which attached to Stalingrad was immensely important. And it worked once the Red Army mounted its counteroffensive and was successful. Of course, that worked to the advantage of the Soviet Union.
Hitler began to find the symbolism of its name increasingly difficult to resist. On the 23rd of July, its capture was placed on a par with the southern advance. By September, defeat at the city named after his arch-rival was unthinkable. Stalin, too, was aware of the symbolic significance involved. As early as the 1st of July, with the German 6th Army approaching the Big Bend of the Don and threatening the road to the city, Stalin told Timoshenko, "I order the formation of an army group Stalingrad. The city itself will be defended by the 62nd Army to the last man."
If the Stalingrad had caved in, and the Red Army, as it planned to do, was to move westwards at high speed, it would have been able to seal off the German army group in the Caucasus, and that would have trapped an enormous number of men. So the argument is that by holding on in Stalingrad until February the 3rd, and obviously constraining a certain element of Russian forces, it enabled German troops who'd penetrated deep in the Caucasus to get out and pull back, and Manstein to build up an improvised defense line and thus more or less stabilize the position, which appeared at one stage, the whole of the German southern wing appeared to be in great jeopardy.
At the time of Stalin's order, the 62nd Army were desperately preparing a defensive position at the Klach bridgehead, west of the Don, supported to the south by the 64th Army and 1st Tank Army. On the 30th of July, the German 6th Army struck north and south of this formation, and by the 8th of August, it was encircled. The remnants of the 62nd and 64th Army pulled back to form a defensive perimeter around Stalingrad, leaving the approach road virtually undefended. On the 23rd of August, the 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus and the 4th Panzer Army crossed the Don and sped towards the city. Despite the resolute defense of the outnumbered Soviet forces, the Germans crashed through the suburbs. Only a rapid withdrawal to the inner city on the 30th of August prevented a complete encirclement of the forward defences. The depleted Russian ranks were bolstered by the addition of 125,000 adult citizens and 7,000 male youths between the ages of 13 and 17. Workers in the munitions factories handed over weapons and equipment to their soldiers as soon as they came off the production lines. As the battle grew in intensity, they were forced to use them themselves. In their eagerness for a rapid victory, the Germans made a severe tactical error. While the firebombing of the Luftwaffe, which was ordered as a prelude to the final assault, created major structural damage, it also constricted the mobility of the attackers. It turned the struggle for occupation into a Rattenkrieg, a rat's war, through the rubble-choked thoroughfares of the city. German tank superiority and aerial dominance counted for very little. The German army's whole tactical training had been concerned with how to avoid such a war of vicious attrition. The defenders, on the other hand, proved adept at this hide-and-seek struggle through the labyrinth of ruined buildings and blocked alleyways to which Stalingrad was reduced. The battle zones contracted to minuscule proportions. In the larger buildings, floors and even stairways were transformed into centers of conflict. Any overview became almost impossible, as the individual buildings changed hands several times in a single day. Back in Germany, the slow progress of its army gave rise to jokes, parodying the official reports from the front. Today, our troops captured a 2-roomed flat with kitchen, toilet and bathroom. They managed to retain 2/3 of it, despite hard-fought counterattacks from the enemy. Nevertheless, the sheer weight of the German attack began to tell. By mid-September, the defense of the city seemed on the point of being overwhelmed. The answer to the question, how close were the Germans to winning the Battle of Stalingrad, is a sobering one.
About 400 yards, because the final stages of the German attack in November had driven Marshal Chuikov right down to the water's edge, and he had his headquarters actually on the water's edge. They were never pushed off, but it got to the stage where the battle, which was a horrendous affair, was grinding down Russian battalion after Russian battalion, as it was with the Germans, by the way. And there was also the argument who could hang on the longest. But that, I think, was very probably between November the 24th and the last week, yes, of November, running into the first few days of December, it appeared to be touch and go.
The result of the war in the East hung once again in the balance. Hitler was disregarding the tactics of the Vernichtungsgedanke, the idea of annihilation by swift blows to the flanks and rear, which had been the basis of all German successes to date. He was disregarding the needs of the campaign in the Caucasus by diverting crucial amounts of manpower to Stalingrad. And totally out of character, he was ignoring the weaknesses of the German flanks along the 60-mile salient which the attack on Stalingrad had created. Hitler was risking everything in his growing obsession with this one city. The Red Army, pressed back against the Volga with the smoking ruins of Stalingrad in front of them, were once again on the rack. The optimism of the early spring had turned sour in a soul-destroying series of defeats which saw further huge tracts of their homeland fall into enemy hands. Should Stalingrad now capitulate, the blow to their morale would be immense. More ominously, the fall of Stalingrad would seal the fate of the Caucasus and pave the way for the final breach of the only barrier to stand between Nazi Germany and absolute control of the European continent. For all the excesses and brutalities of Stalin's Russia, its collapse would unleash an era of cold-blooded slaughter and mayhem such as the world had never before witnessed. In the words of Joseph Goebbels, a time of brutality approaches of which we ourselves have absolutely no conception. In fact, we are in the middle of it. We shall only reach our goal if we have enough courage to destroy, laughingly to shatter, what we once held holy, such as tradition, upbringing, friendship, and human love. The battle for Stalingrad was to continue unabated for another 4 agonizing months, during which time the Germans had captured 90% of the city. But with a display of heroic courage in the face of defeat, the Russians finally threw out their tormentors, and with them, Hitler's demented vision of Russian enslavement and world domination.